you please pray with me? We thank you, God, for all that you have provided for us, even to this day. Thank you for helping us to rise up this morning to greet the day, to gather together online and in person, to be part of community where we can worship you. We thank you for shelter and food and friends and love. Thank you for comfort and for health and healing and for care. Our hearts are overflowing, God. And so receive our gratitude and fill us once again with the inspiration of your Spirit. May my words be faithful to you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Of all the gospel accounts of Jesus being at tables with people, and of all the parables that Jesus tells about tables and dinners and meals, this story of the Last Supper is probably the most well-known meal in all of the Christian tradition. There's been art, music, all kinds of things that have been inspired by this image of Jesus gathered at a table with his friends. And we remember and reenact and retell this story anytime we gather at the table for communion. As we prepare for the Eucharist, we recall how on the night before Jesus was arrested and tortured and crucified, he gathered with his friends around a table. We remember that it was the Passover, and when the hour came to celebrate the ritual meal, they were all together in one room. Jesus and all of his disciples, even the one who had conspired to betray him. This month we have been talking about the significance of tables in Jesus' ministry as places of connection across lines of difference. Because Jesus gathered with Pharisees and tax collectors and sinners. He ate with friends and foes, and he transcended cultural and societal boundaries to break bread with people, to give them a taste of God's kingdom. Tables figured prominently in Jesus' teachings too, as he talked about the contrast between God's kingdom and the ways of the world. God's table is a place where social hierarchies are turned upside down, where the poor and the outcast are given the places of honor, banquets where tables are filled with those who could never return the invitation, where those who are hungry are filled and those who have more than enough to eat are sent away empty. We began this series on All Saints' Day with a vision of Isaiah's table on God's holy mountain, a hopeful future where all people of the earth will gather together and where there will be peace and prosperity for everyone. And we end here at the Passover table with Jesus, sharing bread and cup to symbolize the gift of his body and blood for the sake of the world. And all through this month, we've had the song by the Highwomen, Crowded Table, that has reminded us that the table is a place where we're all a little broken, but everyone belongs. The table as a place of connection also transcends time and culture. We heard this morning this beautiful poem by Joy Harjo, the former poet laureate, about a table that is at the center of a family and of a community, a place where people have experienced many beginnings and endings, where we can gather together even to face the end of the world as we know it, and gather the strength to begin again. At that Last Supper, the disciples must have felt that their world was ending. At that meal, it finally dawned on them that soon Jesus would no longer be with them, that there was great suffering ahead for him and for them. And they were afraid. Despite the fact that Jesus had tried to prepare them by telling them over and over again what was to happen to him, the disciples didn't fully understand. this was the Last Supper that they would have with their friend and teacher before he died. And so when Jesus starts talking about betrayal and death, and they get anxious. They start to argue with each other about which one of them must be the traitor and which one of them was more loyal or greater than the others. But you see, this Last Supper wasn't an ending. It was also the beginning of something new. In the bread and the cup, Jesus was doing a new thing. He was preparing them to carry on the work, the ministry that he had given his life to, and to go out into the world to extend the table of God's love and salvation to others. This was a meal where he showed them how much he loved them by getting down on the floor and washing their feet. This was the table where he gave them a way to remember him always in bread and cup, and to invite others to be followers of Jesus by inviting them to the table too. He calls his disciples to give up their seat to make room for others. I like the way it's interpreted in the Message version, where Jesus says, "Who would you rather be? The one who serves the dinner? You'd rather eat and be served, right? But I've taken my place among you as the one who serves." Once again, Jesus turns the tables to make this meal not the last, but the first, a way for his followers to always remember who we are and what being a disciple of Jesus is all about. And this is why we still gather here, week in and week out, with a table at the center of our worship. Here we are reminded that we belong, and then we are sent out from this table to invite others to the feast. As the evangelist T.D. Niles once said, sharing the good news of Jesus Christ is simply one beggar telling another beggar where they can find food. We rise from this table where we are fed physically and spiritually to share what we have with others who are hungry. And sometimes we do that with actual food, like we did last night at Mount Zion, when we served a Thanksgiving feast to our unhoused neighbors. And other times we show up to witness to God's love in the world by participating in protests against injustices, or reading with children, or giving financial support to organizations that are working for equity and peace. These are all the ways that we extend the grace of this table beyond this place. Last month, leading up to the national election, I spent several days in West Philadelphia with a group called Changing the Conversation, doing what is called deep canvassing. Our goal was to reach low-propensity voters and to talk with them about the importance of participating in the election this year. And we were trained to go out with humility and gratitude, to talk to residents who were mostly Black and poor, not specifically about politics or politicians, but to tell them a love story, to share with them a personal story about someone we love, and to invite them to share a story with us, because this organization believes that voting is an act of love, and it's something we do for the people we love and in hope for the world we want to create. So the story that I told as I knocked on doors in this neighborhood was about my father-in-law, John. I mentioned that he was a school teacher and a football coach, a pastor and a city alderman in his hometown of Collierville, Tennessee. And then I shared about the Thanksgiving we had at his house in 2010. He was so happy to have all of his sons and their wives and grandchildren there at the house. And even though he was sick with cancer, he got up very early in the morning to prepare a Thanksgiving meal for all of us. He cooked all day because it meant so much to him to have his whole family gathered together. I didn't have a close relationship with my own father, so it made me feel so loved to be included and welcomed into this family and embraced by John. We didn't know that this was the last Thanksgiving that we would have with him, and this meal meant even more to us after he died. And after I shared that story, I would then invite the person whose doorstep I was standing on if they would share with me a story about someone they loved. And nearly every time I got to hear a story in return, which was a gift. And then I would say, we are the lucky ones, because we know what it means to love and be loved. And we can share that love with others because we have something to offer the world. There is a lot of work still to be done in this world. And we know that the next 4 years in our country are going to be challenging, especially for vulnerable people like immigrants and transgender folks. And we might feel a lot of despair and exhaustion right now. We might be tempted to feel that in some ways our world is ending. We see the dramatic and devastating impacts of climate change. People are more polarized and divided now than at any time in recent history. Genocidal wars are being fought with our tax dollars, and our democratic institutions are being undermined by corruption, greed, and authoritarian impulses. Then I think about this church and how over so many years, so many times in the past 252 years, through wars and disease, through economic depression and times of great prosperity, through civil unrest and slavery and emancipation and expanding movements for civil rights. Through all those times, week in and week out, this church has gathered at the table. We have gathered around a table and been fed and then sent out into the world to proclaim God's hope and promises of new life in very dark times. And we continue to stand on the side of those who are vulnerable and oppressed and marginalized, and we break bread with them, making space for all God's people at the table. This is the ministry that we have been a part of for a long, long time, and this is who we will continue to be far into the future, well beyond the time that any of us who are here now will be a part of this community. Because the church, God is not done with the church yet. This church and the Church of Jesus Christ will continue to endure and persist and resist when necessary. Because this is not our table. This is God's table. This is not just bread for today, but a foretaste of a heavenly banquet. This is not the end, beloved. This is just the beginning. And so today, I invite you to join me and to invest in the ministry of this church for the next year. And not just for 2025, but for years to come. Believing that this church has a mission and ministry that continue beyond us. Today, we will commit to giving our financial resources as well as our time and talent to the mission and ministry of Dumbarton United Methodist Church. We pledge that it is in and through the ministry of this community that we will seek to be instruments of Christ's love, compassion, and justice in our communities, our nation, and the world, as we seek to embody God's hope. It is here that we will continue to gather week in and week out and to remind each other of who and whose we are. And we will practice living into the vision of a radically welcoming Christian community where people find spiritual nourishment and true belonging, so that we may be sent out into the world as witnesses of God's love and justice. May it be so.
Will you join me, referring to your bulletin, for the call and response? God of honey and harvest, of grain and grape, of ocean and orchard,
this harvest time, may we both praise and pray. Praise you for the abundance, and pray that this harvest is not just shared, but shared justly.
God of beehives and breadbaskets, of living webs, and the weaving of life, of ecosystems and economy.
This harvest time, may we